Hello and welcome everyone. Today we're going to discuss the main challenges and trends in the MENA region in the current context, a context of polycrisis resulting from the overlapping of the new challenges with the long-standing dynamics, and creating an additional uncertainty in the region about the political and economic perspectives. So the picture of some states is already gloomy with the aftermath of the Arab Springs, compounded by the pandemic and the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So there are states that have defaulted, and others who are maintaining some discussions with the IMF in order to calm the pressures in their macroeconomic landscape. So in order to contribute to these discussions, I'm honored to be joined by Mrs. Deborah Perez, assistant professor at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University, and her research interests deal with political actors, parliaments, and regime change in the Maghreb. And Mr. Mouride Schmoll, assistant professor at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University. His broader research areas include the politics of everyday governance, public administration in developing countries, the political economic of development, violence and conflict, with a particular regional focus of the MENA region. So thank you for joining us today. In order to just contextualize our discussion, I will start with the first question, and it would be how we have seen a lot of disruption and arrests during in the MENA region in the past decades. Can you give us just a brief overview of how the current context is different from the previous ones? And I will start with Mr. Mouride. Can you describe the region's economic strand in terms of the difficult recovery from the pandemic and the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, please?
Yeah. So thanks first of all for having me. So the fallout from the war in Ukraine is hitting the region at the worst possible moment. I mean, not that there's a good moment for having an economic crisis, but in this particular case, we had countries recovering from basically 10, 12 years of economic difficulties of various nature. So obviously the financial crisis in 2007, 2008 had some first sort of implications and consequences. The Euro crisis in 2000, sort of like 11, 12, 13, also had some implications because a lot of the trading partners of countries in the region were in severe economic crisis, and that this sort of like affected sort of like the export markets that countries in the region have. But obviously, the perhaps most disruptive event were, of course, the Arab uprisings in 2011, which led to conflict and war in several countries, but also severely affected the tourism sectors in countries that are dependent on tourism, like Egypt, Tunisia, just to name two. These sort of politically induced economic crises sort of reoccurred throughout the 2010s decade. We see it happening later in the countries where we also see the political crisis or the political unrest happening later, like Iraq, Lebanon, Algeria, were sort of like we see events in 2019, and then this sort of like starts to affect also their economic stability. And then, of course, with 2020, we see the pandemic happening as well, which severely affects, again, countries that are massively dependent on tourism, on international travel. And the recovery was, I think, probably going fairly well until we now saw in 2022 the war in Ukraine happening, which again affects certain countries particularly strongly. We're thinking especially of energy and food importers, like, for example, Egypt, with its well known as one of the biggest wheat importers in the world, but also net energy importers like Tunisia and Morocco that are severely dependent on sort of oil and gas, both for domestic consumption but also for their industries. And so the crisis that we see now is just one in a sort of succession of crises that caused basically what some call a lost decade for several countries, especially for countries like Tunisia, for example, that has witnessed a serious sort of stagnation and even decline of its GDP per capita over a period of 10, 15 years. In Lebanon, we're seeing sort of a full-on collapse of the economy and of living standards, where we see now GDP per capita reaching the levels of 30 years ago. So effectively, 3 decades that have been destroyed or lost due to the crisis there. And all of these sort of like crises and the succession of crises is adding to a number of long-standing structural problems that existed even in times when the economic sort of like the conjuncture was better and healthier. And so right now what we're seeing is sort of like these two things coming together, a number of economic crises, the last of which now is sort of like the fallout from the Ukrainian war, but merging with some long-standing sort of structural issues. We can maybe go into more detail later, but balance of payment crisis that we see in countries like Egypt and Lebanon, but more general problems with just the models of development, trying to earn enough foreign exchanges, building reserves, finding development models that are more sustainable in the long run, solving sort of like major fiscal problems that have also sort of accumulated over decades. So it's these are no doubt dire times, and the fallout of the Ukrainian Russian war has no doubt been sort of dramatic in its effects for the region.
Yeah, there's also the inflation, the stagflation discussions, and also the tightening of the financial conditions that could face countries who are already facing some structural vulnerabilities. So how can they finance these reforms, their ongoing reforms with the tightening of financial conditions? Also the inflation that is affecting the most vulnerable and the poor. So now I'll turn more on the political side with Mrs. Deborah for the political shifts that shaped the region. So the discontent observed in the region over the past decade was broadly triggered by the breakdown of the trust between, or the relationship between the states and the citizens. So what are the current political transitions in the region, and in your opinion, how can we redefine the contours of the MENA states in order to rebuild trust between citizens and states?
Thanks. Thank you for having me first. Well, I think the region has been struggling with 2 types of crisis since the last decade, mainly. First, we have long-term structural problems, such as Professor Schmoll just said. You had the issue of the development model, how do government deal with a demographic growth and the need for employment for the youth, and the Arab uprising started because of those socio-economical issues. Exactly. It had to do with finding jobs that were more suited to a population that's more mobile, more connected, polyglot, who speak a lot of languages, more with diplomas, who went to universities. And how do states manage to provide answers to such demands? These are long-term problems, and then the states of the Arab uprising are now in the MENA region are now facing new crises, such as government crisis, having to deal with the food security issues that was triggered by the war with Ukraine and the way that Russia invaded the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and that's why I think that now our governments are here. They need to provide an answer, because all those crises lead to one final question, in fact. People are demanding for more state responsibility and for government to take actions. And this is stands in sharp contrast, I think, with what we were seeing in at the end of the 20th century, you know, with people calling into question the relevance of the state as a level, you know, as a relevant level for action and for government. People were funding region, were thinking region was the key to local governance, to a fairer and a more democratic way to rule, you know, and to implement the rule of law. It was the same for the supranational level. And now I think that states are coming back, and they need to find answers and to provide answers. So at what point at one point the answer was that of implementing stronger elected bodies, and it has to do with electing members of parliament and strengthening parliaments, you know, with the forming up of a constituent assemblies, with the forming up of a new parliament, making new legislation. And this is a first dynamic that was shaping up in the aftermath of the Arab uprising. But this we're at the end of that dynamic now. What we see is a decrease of this type of dynamic, where parliaments are taking a new position and a new strength. And we're seeing parliaments who are being shut down, for instance, such as it happened in Tunisia less than a year ago. And it happened without you know, creating that much reaction among the population. And this calls into question the governing model people want to have. It calls for a strong answer of the state, a strong answer of the administration. And here I think that Lebanon is a sad scenario everybody wants to avoid. You know, it reads as a foil. You know, people want to keep it at a distance, because when you see that the state public administrations are falling down and crumbling, it's something everybody want to avoid in the region.
Yes, indeed. So as I mentioned before, and as you said, there are some states who have defaulted as Lebanon, and there are others who are under pressures, and they are undergoing discussions with the IMF. And I would like to focus on the new agreements between the IMF and the two countries, Egypt and Tunisia. So these agreements have reached on economic policies and the reforms to be supported by new 48 months extended fund facility, which requested access of $1.9 billion for Tunisia and $3 billion for Egypt. So what are the main goals of this new agreement, and what does it mean for the two countries in terms of commitments? What are the challenges behind these agreements, Mr. Morik?
Yeah, so I mean, what's interesting to note to begin with is that both agreements are much smaller than what both governments actually hoped for initially. So Egypt was, you know, banking maybe on an agreement worth approximately $9 billion, and, you know, ended up with $3 billion. I think Tunisia, in the summer, you had government officials hoping for maybe $4 billion. So we're again here talking like less than half of what, you know, that they maybe had hoped for. And so then the question is, you know, why is it that you know, the governments in the end sign these much smaller agreements, even though that they might still be complemented with some finance from other development banks and other funding bodies. But by and large, basically, the agreements are smaller. Well, in the case of Egypt, it seems to be the case that the IMF has put some, you know, during the negotiations, some pretty tough conditionalities on the table. Some things that were sort of like unacceptable to the sort of Egyptian government, and I think the two main ones being the retreat or the progressive retreat of the Egyptian state, and including also for the first time, I think this has been brought up, I think, in negotiations with the IMF, also the retreat of the Egyptian armed forces and their sort of like economic empire from the economy as well, and to give more space to the private sector. And so this was sort of like not really considered acceptable. And then I think also in terms of doing further reforms, or, you know, going further with the reforms of the subsidy system was also not really considered acceptable. And here we also see some similarities with the Tunisian case, where the subsidy question, which is, always comes up sort of like as one of the main conditionalities of almost all IMF programs in the region, is really tricky to solve, because as my colleague Professor Deborah has said, the issue is one that of people actually wanting to have a state that takes more responsibility and that somehow provides for people in the context of economic crisis, of high inflation, of widespread unemployment. So we already have seen poverty rates in the past 20 years going up in both these countries, and now the IMF is saying, okay, we need to sort of like transform the sort of like the main social protection system and scheme that exists in these countries. And obviously this is very tricky, because then there's the question of how much support is this going to get, and how can this really be implemented concretely in practice. I think the IMF is hoping that the governments, or is encouraging governments to replace these systems, not by just cutting them completely, but by replacing them with cash transfers. But there's a reason for which countries in the region have relied mostly on these sort of like universal or broad-based subsidy schemes, because they don't have necessarily the state capacity to identify exactly, who is in need and who is deserving of these sort of like cash transfers. And so they have been sort of like a relatively blunt but still quite effective tool at providing some relief. And so there also have been sort of discussions, or in policy circle often like arguments that it's only mainly sort of like the rich that benefit from subsidies. But in the end, if subsidies on fuel, for example, are lifted, for sure this will benefit or this will hurt most those who actually have a car, and maybe like poor sections of the populations don't have a car, but they may take the microbus, they may take the bus, they may need fuel for cooking, for heating, for other sort of like aspects of their private lives, and so this is a difficult these sort of like subsidy reforms, if they are not replaced with schemes or social protection schemes that sort of like fully compensate for some of these projected losses, are going to be very difficult to implement. And maybe just as a final point, to talk also about the reasons why the agreement with Tunisia was quite a bit lower also than expected, is presumably that the IMF, this is now the fourth agreement within 10 years or so, and so during those 10 years, not much has changed in terms of doing actually structural economic reforms in Tunisia, and the government is, still, even though there's a new government in place, a new president, there's still no real plan for how to move forward with structural economic reform and what kind of development model or growth model the country wants to pursue. And so maybe it could be one hypothesis that the IMF thought, okay, a smaller program, a smaller loan. We first want to see some reforms and some results before we, support the country with more funds and with more money, given that, past programs, in terms of reform at least, haven't really delivered as much as expected.
Exactly. As you said, the country had higher figure about the loan, and they can probably resume their borrowing in international markets, which could affect the debt sustainability of the country. And now we're talking about the structural reform that include also how can we sustain debts in levels that cannot harm the long-term growth.
Absolutely.
So of course.
If I may take up on that idea, it's true that for the last 10 years, Tunisia has been borrowing a lot of money from IMF and World Bank. They've been benefiting a lot from those programs. But what happened at first is that everybody wanted to help the Tunisian democratic story, and it was the democratic lab. It was where democracy was being implemented with a new constitution and such. And so in the year 2011, the debt of Tunisia was demultiplied, and the money was used to provide employment for youth, and some little helps like khadayer, like a little bit of there was an incitation to build on NGOs and for young people to commit to association dedicated to implementing democracy, that kind of things. And so the state has a very, very strong influence as an employer. In fact, it has a social dimension that should not be minimized. And people in Tunisia still remember the first structural plans of adjustment that were implemented in the 1980s, and everybody's a bit scared about that. And so there's a trust issue, not only with the government, but of course with the World Bank and the IMF. And the thing is to see how this money is going to be used. And now I think that in the last year and last couple of years even, so Tunisia has been asking again for help, but there's been no reform of the tax system. There's no reform on like how enterprises are being taxed. The state is still employing a lot of people, and there's been this transitional justice where people from Ennahda, for instance, but not only people from Ennahda, also people who just lost their job in the civil service system because of their political opinion could gain access to it, could get their old jobs back. And sometimes it was not even them, they transmitted this job to their daughters or their son, because having employment in the civil service still means something. So there's through this question of the debt, I think there's still the issue of how to redefine state and what's his role, as a way to ensure social welfare to its inhabitants and to its citizens.
Exactly. So how can these potential changes can affect or can bring some modifications in the reform agenda of the MENA regions?
Well, first, I think there's been, when I was speaking a tad earlier about this movement of decrease of parliaments, along with this increase of power of parliaments, we've seen people coming from political Islam getting into power. New people were being elected, and they were bringing with them new idea on how to implement reform. But with the failure of political Islam, what we saw is that a lot of people coming from the economic sphere of society got into politics, and they started to get elected as members of parliaments. And they fought inside the commissions of finance, and because the budget of the state is quite often in the MENA region, it's lower finance where are being voted inside parliaments. And the UNDP, the World Bank, the IMF, they pushed for that kind of reform to make finance a matter of law and a matter of parliament. But now we see that these people who come from the union of, who come from the economic capital mostly, and from the economic sector, they push their own agenda inside the finance committees, and therefore they manage to kind of fix and freeze the tax system. So I think that's a big issue if you want to commit to some structural reform of the way enterprises are being taxed. So that's probably the first lock one might want to push aside or to work on. And then I think there's also an issue on how to consult with people, and maybe there's some new reforms that could come from within the administration, and that could come from the reformatist elite that has been working closely with the administration, but whose ideas have been systematically put aside for the last 10 years or so.
So we can understand there are many changes, many trends, many things happening in the region. And my last question, if I may, for both of you professors, as researchers and academics, what would be the new areas and focuses of research on the MENA region, taking, of course, into account these current developments and emerging trends?
Well, maybe I'm a bit biased here because I work on sort of like the state and public administration myself, but a lot of the literature in this area has been quite old actually, and so there have been works in the 90s on that, and on state reform, on describing also like the way that the state changed under the different pressures coming out of like the exhaustion of previous development models, of various economic and fiscal crises, etc. But there's, I think, still a lot to be learned and discovered in the way that especially the state now deals with some of these pressures and some of these crises. In many ways, I think governments are sort of cornered at the moment. The options that were on the table maybe just a few years ago in terms of like how to pursue certain paths, in terms of how they organize and redistribute wealth, how they produce wealth, are not really on the table anymore. And oftentimes the sort of like immobilism that we see at the government level, and we see it in Lebanon, we see it in Tunisia, we see it in other countries, in the case of Egypt as well, when we look at their sort of like recent monetary crisis, we see that oftentimes government states are struggling to provide answers, and are sort of like running out of options, and towards the end, once they're finally committed to a decision, oftentimes they don't really have many choices anymore, and trying to get a closer and a better sense of how maybe within states these shifts and changes are happening, how these pressures are transmitting also to the local level, where we see also just civil servants being actually part of perhaps not even like just only the state anymore, but also of society, in the sense that the struggles of a police officer in Lebanon making $50 a month will be similar to the struggles of like the rest of the country as well. So I think the question of the state is definitely one to sort of like look at greater detail in the upcoming years.
For you,
I quite agree with Professor Schmoll. I think for the last 20 or 30 years, most research on the MENA region have been mostly dealing with political Islam, with violence. People were focusing on the state, but only from a point of view that had to do with democratization, authoritarianism. And then after the Arab uprising, people have been rediscovering the theory of social mobilization through the MENA region. So that was one of the most often used prism in order to study MENA societies. And then I think that now we need to focus more on public administration, on government, not only on elected bodies, but also institutions. And what you said about administration, but not only the administration at the national level, also at the intermediary level and at the street level, because the street level bureaucracy, I think, is key to understand how you deliver a proper public service. And it's really useful, it's a useful level to study if one wants to grasp what's at stake when civil servants are trying to do something with the population, but are intertwined in a network of constraints and opportunities that's difficult to describe in a concise manner. So that I'd probably advocate for that kind of thing. But I also think that climate change is a huge issue. And for the last 2-3 years, we can see very empirically what it's going to do in the MENA region with the droughts that are being, that are becoming more and more frequent in the region, and that are calling into question the issue of food security. Exactly. And once again, how the state and administration going to answer to that, because it's going to create new social demands. So how are they going to answer that type of questions?
Especially since agriculture, in terms of maybe not in terms of percentage of GDP, but in terms of percentage of overall employment is still a massive a sector for many countries in the region, and so there's always sort of like a bit of the assumption that climate change is as an object of political interest or of political action and mobilization and importance, considered to be more like something of the sphere of developed countries. But I think it's absolutely true that this will be sort of like at the heart of the politics of rural areas, the politics of agriculture, the politics of food security in the coming years.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor, for your time and your insightful answers. It was indeed an interesting discussion about the challenges of the MENA region. So thank you so much. Thank you.